Old people of Reddit, what were elders from your time ranting about? The bands that I got into trouble for listening to Van Halen, Def Leppard etc. are now background music at Walmart, the UPS store. My parents used to tell me how lucky I was to have electricity, hot water etc. They said only rich people had cars when they were young. Now only rich people have horses. Same things as always. Young people have no work ethic, bad music, and too much sex. Dungeons and Dragons would cause a psychotic break. Background to the myth was rather sad. The psychotic break idea started because of the disappearance of James Dallas Egbert, which became a media frenzy and got fictionalized into 2 novels by 2 different authors and then a made-for-TV movie starting a really young Tom Hanks. Egbert was nearly a child prodigy. He started college at Michigan State University at age 16. One day he disappeared. The press took an interest. His family hired a private detective named William Deere, and Deere both found Egbert and told the press that the kid had a psychotic break while playing a D&D game. Deere was lying. He was lying for the best of reasons though. What had actually happened was Egbert had tried to top himself. He was at least 2 years younger than any of his classmates, which was stressful in itself. Adding to that, he was also gay, and the Midwest in the 1970s was not an accepting place toward LGBT people. Egbert had gone down to the tunnels beneath his dormitory, which was part of a connecting set of basements across several university buildings. Taken pills, which didn't kill him but kept him asleep until after his disappearance was already all over the news. He really didn't want to face the media, so he went to hide in a friend's house in either Texas or Louisiana. Accounts vary. At this point the private detective Deere found him. Out of consideration for Egbert's health, Deere made up an explanation to keep the press away from Egbert and hoped public interest would subside. The opposite happened. This caught the public's imagination and became a phenomenon. Deere held his silence through the novelization and the TV adaptation, then published his explanation with apologies in the 1980s. Deere's timing was again for the best of reasons. He didn't want to muck up again and draw any more attention to a profoundly depressed young man. He also made a promise to Egbert to keep silent. Egbert ended his own life at age 22-17. Deere did his best to set the record straight after Egbert's death, but the game was stigmatized in the public imagination by that time. Egbert wasn't a LARPer and there's no hard evidence he ever played D&D. There had been a gaming magazine in his dormitory when he went missing, and gaming options were really thin in 1979. That and the fact that he had gone lost in the tunnels were it. Incidentally, by the time Deere published in 1984 a different, equally tragic, equally specious, and even more lurid scandal had connected D&D to Satanism in the public imagination. Rock and roll and Elvis hip gyrations. I'm in my early 50s, so I guess that counts as old. Don't watch so much TV. I could only watch half an hour of TV a day, so I'd go to my friends' houses after school where the parents weren't so strict. Don't sit so close to the TV. Go outside and play. You've been on the phone for an hour. You just saw your friends at school. Get off the phone. One of my husband's relatives is like 70-something, and she's a very nice lady, but she is vehemently against D&D. Supposedly, as it was explained to us, she believes that you have to do some kind of satanic ritual to bind demons to your service so they make you get good dice rolls and make your character do well. Honestly, that sounds way more exciting than D&D actually is. Kiss. They were knights in Satan's service. Satanic members with their devil music. It's like light rock now. The Beatles and rock and roll suck. Frank Sinatra and lounge music is going to be popular forever. Whatever the latest new media is, comic books in the 50s, TV in the 60s and 70s, video nasties in the 80s, computer games in the 90s. But amazingly, even books were once seen as a dangerous craze. Back in the 18th century, many prominent voices were concerned about the threat posed by people reading too much. A dangerous disease appeared to afflict the young, which some diagnosed as reading addiction and others as reading rage, reading fever, reading mania or reading lust. Throughout Europe, reports circulated about the outbreak of what was described as an epidemic of reading. The Simpsons. When it came out in Australia, there was a lot of controversy over Bart being a bad influence on children and to a much lesser extent Homer being abusive. Hell, there were politicians trying to have it removed from the airwaves, and that was before that insulting episode where they came to Australia. Madonna being a bad role model for girls. MTV. Crayola-colored hair. My grandfather talks about how his father thought that the automotive industry was going to be the end of Western civilization because cars are making us fat and lazy. My parents complained all the time that I spend all my free time at the computer and I'd be a beggar and complete failure in life. I'm software engineer for 20 years. Gas went up to 20 cents a gallon. Beatniks. Too much TV. You should be outside. Length of hair. Our music. Hairstyles. Fashion. Lack of morals. Etc. I am an old guy now myself, but I refrain from getting into intergenerational flame wars with the younger folk. This my group is good. Your group is bad. Stuff gets real old. Real fast. I was looking to read answers from the 50s, 60s, and maybe 70s, and nope, I'm the audience for this question. So, elders from my time ranted about sitting too close to the TV, which I watched too much, my crap handwriting, and spending too much time fiddling with my TI-99 4A. Anyone else learn BASIC by making Mr. Bojangles? Running up the long-distance phone bill. I don't think kids nowadays even are aware we used to pay extra for calls out of state. Not an old people, but Socrates thought writing things down instead of memorizing them would destroy learning forever. Heavy metal, D&D, too much TV, smoking, skateboarding, you are 14, get a job. My granddad was furious at me using a pedaled whetstone as opposed to an honest-to-goodness wet rock to sharpen my scythe for harvesting wheat. I don't think of myself as old, exactly 48. But I remember my grandparents born in the 1910s calling the music of the 60s, 70s and 80s, noise. And when I listen to the music from their era it is different. And I feel sad. Their music wrapped between world wars tried to be happy but always seemed mournful, like their generations couldn't forget what they couldn't forget. Some folks born in the 40s and 50s changed it in the 60s and 70s. They didn't change the world, but they sure gave us some great music. I can't find the thread, but I do remember reading about someone whose grandma, I think, distrusted books, specifically novels, fiction, because they would encourage people to live in fantasy worlds instead of the real world. My granny, born 1920, was in the car with us listening to the radio when the Beatles came on. She said, I used to think the Beatles were just a load of noise, but compared to this newer stuff they're actually quite pleasant. So basically, always music. Not much of an elder myself, but this quote from around 2100 years ago always made me laugh. Times are bad. Children no longer obey their parents and everyone is writing a book. Marcus Cicero, 106–46 BC. The only thing I ever heard my maternal grandfather rant about was the length of men's hair. Other than that, my grandparents never ranted. All four of them had tons of cool stories to tell. My paternal grandmother died shortly before my 5th birthday, so I didn't get to hear much of hers. But I remember, I miss hearing about the old days from the rest, and even stories from the war. I'm now in the process of writing them all down for my kids. Taxes and commies. My grandpa said, as a kid he would help all day at a dairy farm. From the time he woke up until evening, instead of being paid, he would get a piece of bread with freshly churned butter. Churning was one of his jobs, with honey on top. The way he talked about that piece of bread, I remember so vividly, and that was over 20 years ago. Those goddamned, pot-smokin', anti-war, tree-hugging, socialist, anti-gun, anti-America, communist, hippies. Things said about the young boomers. Too many drugs. Too much partying. Working mothers equals bad. Black people. Wars. Government telling them what to do. No jobs. Not enough money for all their kids. Homosexuals. drugs, heroin and pot most, but changed around the 80s to crack cocaine. Having to work 16+ hours a day to have a house and food to feed a family. Police brutality. Just a few that I remember. Comic books. We were all spoiled with how much we ate, especially meat and out-of-season veg. You should never waste food. Leftovers cooked into the next meal constantly. Didn't trust the government. Felt that you should learn to do everything yourself, not pay anyone to do it. Bad DIY everywhere and homebrew booze. Basically, after living through rationing and war, that you shouldn't be wasteful. There was other more paranoid anti-change stuff, but mostly it was about hard graft and frugality. Note, this was my great-grandfather, I'm not that old. 1. Rock music being too loud and not being able to understand the words. 2. Guys having long hair. 3. People protesting the Vietnam War. 4. Teenagers and young women wearing the skirts and shorts too short. 5. Marijuana being evil. 6. Kids being disrespectful to adults. 7. The open, casual attitude about sex. 8. The lack of chaperones on dates. 9. The women's movement 1970s. 10. Kids should be seen and not heard. 11. Kids watching too much damn TV. Using the word cool too often. Germany. I remember my grandmother complaining about her soap opera having coloreds kissing. It really upset her. My mom, 87, can't understand why kids these days don't use a top sheet or washcloths. I try to tell her about duvet covers and liquid soap, but she doesn't seem to retain it. Then again, she dyes her hair with shoe polish. I guess 63 qualifies. I remember my parents losing their minds over the excessively long hair worn by the Beatles, and the hippies in general. Any Gen X that had to put up with being ranted at hears it when someone says any of the modern things about millennials not taking the same path they took, despite the fact that in 20 years the world has changed. Just walk in and ask for a job. Bad hairstyles, loud music, messed up fashions. I'm a baby boomer. Every time I would complain about something, feeling sad, or nervous, or shy, my dad would say, well, I felt nervous when I was hip deep in French mud, getting shot at by the Germans. Glenn Miller and his bandwagon to hell. The formative experiences for our elders were the Depression, which saw people of means become beggared in a short time, and World War II, which affected virtually every American family. So, anything that was not the Depression or World War II was okay to them. We were raked over the coals for asking a dime for a popsicle. We didn't have popsicles during the Depression. You kids are spoiled. You want everything handed to you. Both my parents were immigrants and they were accustomed to Spartan lives as kids, and their idea of happiness was plenty to eat and heat in the house. And today I see sneakers for $300 a pair, and I recall that this was my father's pay for a month when I was in grammar school. Maybe put this on an ad in a newspaper and you'll get some replies. Broadsheets. Grandpa found them hard to read at breakfast table and preferred tabloid format. Woman getting their ears pierced. Tattoos were for sailors. Free love. Weed. Hot pants. Woman wearing too much makeup. I'm not a parent, but it always shocks me when I hear my late 30s, early 40s friends complaining about their own kids behaving exactly the same way we did when we were kids, except for some specific historical references. Every answer in this thread could be written 30 years from now. Music, clothes, school, drugs, sex, work ethic. It's literally the same complaints. Every generation. Does something happen when you have kids that just makes you forget everything about what you were like when you were young? It wasn't so much what they said but what they had been through and didn't ever talk about. Almost all of the old dudes had seen WW2 with people they knew dying all around them. They grew up in a time when a bowl of beans and a piece of bread was dinner and lucky to have it. Yes, they bitched about long hair and shook their heads at fashion and music, but there was so much more that they didn't even bother to say because we just wouldn't get it. D&D. Kids are killing themselves so their characters can stay alive. It's teaching them to worship Satan and cast spells. Yep. Bunch of nerds. Rolling dice. Willing to die for a couple of sheets of paper with some pencil marks on them. Makes me wonder what millennials will frown upon in a couple years. Kids are gonna have to find some really absurd ways to rebel. Though I told you to stop wearing your pube hats. I don't care if the style is to wear the skull of your childhood pet as a codpiece. If you live in my house you'll listen to my rules. No son of mine is gonna be a religious. How much a concert ticket cost? My mom finally, at 14, let me go to an alternative music festival with my friend I'd been secretly saving for. $42. She couldn't believe it. Highway robbery for a day-long music festival. I got to see Green Day straight from the Nimrod release, and the Foo Fighters. I hoped they would play Monkey Wrench. Back in her day it was $10 for a pretty decent concert. And why are the singers yelling? That's not real music. Now Engelbert Humperdinck, that was a real crooner. I came back dirty and disheveled from the mosh pit. She was horrified. A young lady being thrown around. How dare.